On January the 20th, 2022, the Doomsday clock was set at 100 seconds to midnight, and that is where it has indeed remained since its inauguration in 1947, created by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is a collection of individuals, experts on nuclear weapons and their capacity. They tell us where we stand as it pertains to humanity being on the brink of destruction. Political scientists and so on are also a part of this collection of individuals. And this is the closest we've ever been to complete imminent extermination. And I wanted to discuss this, especially with what's going on today with us once again staring down the throat of nuclear warfare. But I also wanted to go through several times throughout history. I won't go through them all. I probably don't even know of them all because there are plenty of instances, incursions, if you will, throughout history where we have faced this same ordeal. The one we're dealing with now is simply the latest. So at its conception in 1947, I believe it was June 1947, the minute hand was set at 7 minutes to midnight. Therefore, in 1953, with the nuclear disaster of 1953, the minute hand was then moved 2 minutes to midnight. Somehow they miraculously avoided nuclear disaster and humanity was allowed to live on. That is a theme, a recurring theme that you'll see here, as if some divine intervention was at play here to enable the survival of the human species. Fast forward to something that all of us, or most of you, may be aware of, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963. The U.S. had had missiles pointed at the Soviets in Italy and Turkey, and they had missiles in Cuba. And amidst this large crises, U.S. destroyers began to drop bombs in the areas of where Soviet submarines were. They came under attack by these U.S. destroyers, and they had thought that a war had begun. And their initial reaction was to fire nuclear-tipped missiles, which would have definitely sparked a world war as a result of it. But there were 3 different commanders occupying these submarines, and they took a vote. And the vote was 2 out of 3 in favor of firing the nuclear-tipped missiles. They needed unanimous consent to go ahead with the endeavor. Therefore, it didn't happen. And the one man that voted against it is a man by the name of Vasily Arkhipov. And he is a man that is largely recognized as someone who, quote unquote, saved the world, because in a sense, he quite literally did, averting us from nuclear destruction. But of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis in its entirety was an extremely perilous time in history because I believe it was Khrushchev at the time, the leader of the Soviets, proposed a public agreement that both missiles on both sides be removed. JFK, being the U.S. president at the time, made a very foolish decision to decline his offer. Need I state the fact that the missiles, I believe, in Turkey were actually obsolete, and they were set to be replaced by even more dangerous missiles. So it goes without saying that the missiles placed in Turkey and Italy were more of a threat to the Soviets than the missiles placed in Cuba were pointed at the United States. You do with that information what you will. But of course, a secret deal was struck, and we got out of that situation through the skin of our teeth. The evidence is all around us. We are here today as a result of it. And the last example that I want to give you where we avoided nuclear disaster is the flight, the Korean flight of 007. I believe it was 1983 when a flight that left from New York, I believe it stopped in Alaska, and it went towards Seoul in Korea, and it entered Soviet territory by mistake through the negligence of the people that were running the plane. And long story short, it got shot down, and no survivors made it through. Over 200 people died. And 3 weeks later, a man by the name of Stanislav Petrov. He was an Air Force official in the Soviet regime at the time. He saw on their radar that there were American missiles heading towards them in Soviet Russia. And instead of responding in the way that they typically respond with it, which is with a nuclear attack of their own, he came to the decision that it may have been a malfunction, which it later turned out it indeed was. So he defied orders, which is to have the typical response of launching an attack in return, and he didn't do it. And we avoided nuclear disaster once again. And now I sit here today as we have the situation with Russia and the Ukraine, with Vladimir Putin. This is from foreign policy analyst Clint Ehrlich. He has expressly threatened to use nuclear weapons if we intervene in Ukraine, and Russia has put its nuclear forces on high alert to underscore the seriousness of that threat. We sit here staring at this. There is loads of weapons going into Ukraine to, from Germany, from the West, from NATO allies to fend off the Russians. And we seem to be in one of those moments in history again where we are on the brink of extermination. But there is hope that we can still, although it may seem like a pipe dream at this point, I assure you, I really have a very optimistic take about this. And I think that this can be solved through diplomacy. We know the means in which this can be stopped. It's just a question of whether if those means will be explored. To end off this, I want to leave you with a quote from Noam Chomsky. I feel like I've been quoting him a lot lately. But he says the one barrier to the threat of destruction is an informed, engaged public acting together to confront the threat. And that is true in every other instance as well. In order to challenge power, especially private power, we have to use the means of a popular sentiment among the public, mass demonstrations. We're seeing those demonstrations currently in Russia. I've been seeing anti-war protests across the U.S. in the news, and that truly does give me hope going forward. But hopefully we can find a means to divert this entire situation to avoid, of course, nuclear war, which, without saying, means extermination of the human species.